right, so I am going to take about 4 inches off here and save my back for tomorrow because that's the smart choice. All right. Number 2 is reflecting the character of God. So the way I've broken these things up for today and tomorrow is that tomorrow we're dealing with a lot of technical things, more how to handle criminal abuse, how to deal with policy, how to deal with church security and safety, the nitty-gritty of different abuse issues, child abuse, domestic violence, those kind of things. Today, we're laying a lot of philosophical groundwork, theological and philosophical groundwork, because if we're coming to abuse, and the topic of this, which is the source of so much pain for so many people, if we're coming to this from the perspective of flawed belief systems, which we're human, so we all have. I'm just assuming we all have some flawed belief systems. But if we're coming to this topic with deeply ingrained belief systems that are actually unbiblical, then any of our conclusions are very likely going to also be what? Unbiblical and unsafe. More than unbiblical, unsafe. So our next session, we've established talking about PTSD and trauma and ACEs and the masks that we hide behind. Our next session is about reflecting the character of God and why the character of God is such an incredibly important part of understanding how to effectively respond to abuse. Now, minor housekeeping thing, Ms. Rhonda told me that a number of people have been asking where you'll be able to see these later. So they will be on my YouTube channel later, and I will be sending that out by email to everyone who has signed up on the iPad that is going around with your email address. So right now they're live streaming on the church Facebook page, but later they'll be available on the YouTube channel and my YouTube channel. And so if you want to get that, please make sure and keep the iPad going around. Is that one still processing, everybody? People somewhere? Just took it out. All right, people have got it. Awesome, that's all I needed to know. So I'll also be sending, one of the things that goes straight to you as soon as you sign up for that is the best books to read list. It's a curated, recommended reading list for trauma recovery and becoming an advocate and different types of things. Also has a lot of kids resources on there for working with children who have been through a lot. So anyway, that being said, let's roll through on this one. One of my favorite quotes ever is this one right here. The greatest want of the world is the want of men. Men who will not be bought or sold. Men who in their inmost souls are true and honest. Men who do not fear to call sin by its right name. Men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole. Men who will stand for the right, though the heavens fall. When men and women stand up and we take the time and the care to show the character of Christ to those around us, women, children, other men who have been vulnerable, who have been wounded, we are repairing the broken image of God in the hearts of the wounded. Now I recognize, and this is my standard caveat, I recognize that both men and women can be victims of abuse. Abuse is not, domestic violence is not a 100% gendered situation where all women are victims, or all victims rather, are women and all perpetrators are men. Abuse is a human problem. Abuse is a sin problem. And there are times when men are also victims of abuse. As hard as it is for women to come forward and say, I have been abused, I have been victimized, this has happened to me, it is even harder for men to come forward because the stigma of being a victim of abuse as a man is incredibly hard to overcome. That being said, abuse is a heavily gendered issue. The vast majority of victims of physical, sexual, financial abuse are women. The vast majority of perpetrators of those forms of abuse are men. Now, studies show that if you strictly assess emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse, it gets to be more 50-50 as to who's doing what. But when we're talking about physical, sexual, financial, the majority of the time, women are the victims. Now, I'm saying that because in this training, it gets really clumsy if every time I refer to a victim or a perpetrator, I have to say he or she or they and use all the possible pronouns that could apply in any given situation. So for the sake of clarity, when I'm referring to victims, I refer to it as a woman. When I'm referring to perpetrators, I refer to men. And I want to make very clear that I know that there are times when it is the other way around. Just laying that groundwork. But it's just really clumsy to say, and it's hard to listen to. So I'm going to spare your ears all the extra grammar, and we're just going to keep it clean for the sake of the presentations. Emotional brokenness destroys our relationships with God and others. This is a quote from Nicole Parker. God is relational, and most human brokenness is too. Because the law of God is all about relationships, sin is all about breaking righteous relationships. If sin is all about relationships, then the inverse must also be true, right? Righteousness is also about relationships. Family was created to reflect God's heart. God's heart is his character. God's character is love. 1 John 4, God is love. Anyone who is of God shows love. Loving well. 1 Corinthians 13 tells us that. Love is what? Patient. Love is what? Kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. Love does not puff itself up. So, these are things that show us what love is. Loving well also focuses on what is most likely to bring the other person to the point of accepting Christ and salvation and responsibility for whatever they have chosen to do. So when we talk about God's character being love, we are not talking about God's character being full of fluff, hugs, pats on the back, and you know what? Just do whatever feels right for you. We're talking about God wanting to save us from sin and often from ourselves. So, family is the first glimpse that we have that was created and designed to teach us what love looks like. We get our first picture of God primarily through the example of our fathers. That does not mean that there are not great moms who work very hard to show Jesus to our children. I know a lot of those mamas. But instinctively, at a core level, our earliest exposure to what we think God must look and act like is our dad. My friend Ty Gibson says, God will draw us to himself with love or not at all. So, you have this picture here. Dad and mom, these two pieces of our childhood picture of God, right? These two pieces that are supposed to fit together. And we see various aspects of God's character flowing through dad and flowing through mom, down to the child. The love from God being presented to the child through dad's character and through mom's character. When the child continues to grow into maturity, they begin to be able to transfer that understanding through mom and dad directly to God. Instead of dad and mom standing in place of God to the child, and I don't mean that in some blasphemous kind of way, but when you have a little kid, they don't have a really big, solid, clear picture of what God is. Their major authority figures are mommy and daddy, right? And as you grow into more spiritual, social, psychological, emotional, mental maturity, you are able to transfer your understanding of your parental authority figures onto your relationship with God, so that it's not a relationship with God because of mom and dad, but it's a relationship with God on your own. And that's this step. Now here's the problem. When we have fathers who grossly misrepresent the character of God, then the child is only getting some of the picture of the character of God that God originally wanted the child to get. Now, I'm a single mom, and I have been for several years, and I know how hard so many mommies work to try to be both parents to our kids. So I am not talking about this in a way that says that single moms or single dads are somehow deficient, or you're just not giving your kid the best. That is not where I'm coming from with this. I'm talking about the experience of the child as they're growing up, missing parts of their picture of God, or having parts of their picture of God actively destroyed because dad is involved with abuse, addiction, abandonment, adultery, or just plain absent. And when a child is looking at their human element, their human example, their human model of who is supposed to be helping them understand what God looks like, and that father figure is instead abusing, abandoning, just absent, then it really messes up our childhood, which becomes our adulthood, image of the character of God. And we instinctively begin to conclude at this deep core part of ourselves that God also may be abusive, that God also will be angry and lash out at me, that God also is probably going to abandon me if I'm not perfect, that God also is going to have cycles and rages like an addict, that God also will be unfaithful to me, and he really isn't engaged, he's absent in my life. I really just have to depend on myself and do it alone. Now here is where the church comes in. You see, it is possible, even if a father chooses not to redo, to try to make up for those years, even if a father stays absent, abusive, adultering, abandoning, whatever that is, this is where the church comes in. Because we can gather together and help those who have been wounded through this childhood experience to re-understand, to better grasp the picture of the character of God. And when church and family and mentors say, we will step in, we will fight for you, we will intercede for you, we will intervene on your behalf, we will do whatever we can to be supportive after what you have been through, then you have an opportunity where parents have failed or been untrained or been ignorant or just been awful. You have the opportunity for church and safe mentors to take those places and piece that back together so that the child, who may now be an adult, can relearn or learn for the first time how to understand the picture of God's character of love. And that is why we fight against abuse. Not because we can go change every abuser, because we can't. God does not violate free will, including your free will if you choose to stay toxic. He's just not going to do it because that's not how God works. The violation of free will is an abusive thing. God is not abusive. God does not violate free will. Many times, even when justice doesn't happen here on earth, even when court doesn't make the right decision, or someone never gets charges pressed, or something never actually gets resolved, what matters most to those who were the victims in that experience is that somebody cared enough to fight for them. We can't help a system that's broken. Sometimes the justice system doesn't come through. But we can let the person who was wounded in the process know we believed enough to fight for you. Tim Clinton says we are wounded in relationships and we are healed in them too. Reverend Theodore Hesburgh says the most important thing a father can do for his children is to love their mother. Now, this leads us into one of the things that becomes a really big deal when we're talking about representing the character of God. Ephesians 5. Anybody ever heard Ephesians 5 used as a battering ram to tell women to shut up and submit? Because I never have. I just thought that maybe I would bring it up during this session today in case anyone else ever had. Ephesians 5. She's laughing at me over there. Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now, the next part is wives, submit to your husbands, and we're going to get a little more into that. But when we're talking about this, the most important thing a father can do for his children is to love their mother. Well, you know what? Guess what? The Bible says the same thing. Husbands, love your wives. So here's the thing, though. There's this little caveat in that sentence. Husbands, love your wives. How? I can't hear you guys. This is a really big room. As Christ loved the church. So the next question is, and this is where I get to play English major, which is what I studied at the university a few miles down the road, a year or two ago, or 20. And we get to pick things apart. Literature classes. Did anybody else take English at Southern? Yes? No? A few? Anybody sit through Dr. McClarty's classes? Yes? Anybody sit through Dr. Haluska's classes? My favorite. Yeah. So, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So, what did Christ do to show his love for the church? Did he just say, hey, I love you, make me a sandwich? He set aside himself, his identity, his power, his status to serve his bride, to save her, to rescue her, to defend her, no matter the cost to himself. And that is how godly husbands are called to love their wives. It's no small calling. So we have a lot of cultural discussion about whether or not men should go first, right? I had a conversation with my 10-year-old son recently who was discussing whether or not he really needed to do the dishes because he decided it was his sister's day. And in our house, there is no such thing as a sibling division of labor based on gender. It doesn't exist. You trade off months. This is your month to do this. This is your month to do that. At the end of 30 days, you better be good at the job you've been doing for the last month. And I don't care if it's laundry or dishes or scrubbing the toilet. We're all going to take our turns with it. So, but he decided that she should have to do the dishes. And then he decided to say that the reason she should have to do the dishes is because Adam was created before Eve. Thank you very much. And we weren't alone in our house at that time, and I saw every other adult in the room turn and look at me to see how exactly I was going to handle that one. So we went through a little bit of a refresher course on the order of things in creation. Because before Adam, there was animals, and before animals, there was grass. And did each of those things have a greater reason to exempt themselves from doing their job, simply because they were created before Adam was? He didn't like that so much. And so we talked about how each thing that was created in the order of creation was actually there for the purpose of either protection or sustainability, protection or provision of the thing that came after. Light, air, water, atmosphere, and I'm not even necessarily going in order, but all those things preceded land. Grass came before the animals who needed to eat the grass, right? There were waters in oceans before there were fish. Each thing that was created first was created to protect and provide for the thing that was created next. So if Adam was created before Eve, what was his job? To protect and provide for the thing that was created, the creature that came after. And then Eve was the end of the line, and they rested. So when we have this idea that men go first, I'm not talking about it from a feminist point of view. I'm talking about it from a biblical point of view. Leadership, Psalm 82 Initiative is one of my favorite things. If you are on Facebook and you follow advocacy pages, Psalm 82 Initiative is a fabulous advocacy page to follow. Personal friends with the guy who runs that. And one of the things that he says over and over again is that leadership is not tellership. Leadership is not where we go and boss everyone else around, right? Leadership is about protecting, providing, and serving, using whatever power we have to protect and provide for those around us, not about who gives the orders. And so I introduced my son to this concept. Yes, godly men go first, absolutely. First through the gate of danger, first to forgive, first to serve, first to love, first to die, because that is how Jesus loves the church. He needed to think on that for a little while. I let him think on that while doing the dishes. One of the things I tell young women who are out in the dating world, don't look for a leader. Wait, what? No. If you're single and you hope to find someone, young, college age or not, don't look for a leader. Because charisma is very, very easily duped into looking like fantastic leadership and actually being all about ego. Do not look for a leader. Do you know what you look for? Someone who lives the fruits of the Spirit. We'll talk about that more later. True leadership is servant leadership. A servant leader sacrifices themselves for those they lead. Godly leadership is rooted in reflecting whose character? The character of God, right? And rejecting the aspects of power over and self-exaltation shown by Lucifer. So let's just go back in history a little bit. Way back. And then back a little further. In heaven, Lucifer is perfect, right? He's a holy angel. He's one of the leaders. He's the most beautiful, the smartest, and he decides he wants to be equal with God. Jesus is the polar opposite. Philippians 2, 8 and 9. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore, God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every other name. True servant leaders sacrifice, and any godly honor and authority that any of us have flows from that sacrifice. Power is not the issue. Now, sometimes it's easy to step back and you say, hey, well, then nobody should have power over anyone else. Well, that's not reasonable. We live in a world where everybody has differing levels of strength, and equalizing everyone isn't the answer. It's not communism. We don't live in communism. The gospel is not about communism. That's what I'm trying to say. Equalizing everyone's power doesn't solve anything, because everyone has power over someone else somehow. Parents have power over children. Bigger people have power over smaller people. It's just physics. Bosses, power over employees. People with money, power over people who don't have so much. You cannot eliminate and equalize everyone's power. What God calls us to do is use any power we have to protect and provide for others who have different or less power than we do. Now, when we are talking about husbands, love your wives. When we are talking about husbands loving your wives and loving with the mindset of Jesus Christ, then one of the big questions is, well, isn't the man supposed to be the boss, right? Has anyone ever heard of headship arguments and who's in charge and who's the head of the family and all of these kind of things? Now, I don't care where you fall on the spectrum of what you believe as far as whether the man should be the default head of the family or both partners are equal in leadership. We could argue all that, and that is not why I'm here today. I don't care where you stand on that. What I do care about is that we base our understanding of healthy relationships on the love of God, not on a human interpretation of it. Can you agree with me on that? We probably have some differing opinions in this very room about who's the boss and when and how much of a boss and what makes a boss and what a boss acts like and all of that kind of thing. But here's the thing. Ultimately, Jesus is our head, right? There is no head but Christ. And husbands are supposed to love like Jesus. So I'm going to blow your minds for a quick second. When a pastor says to a wife, go home, pray more, love him better, forgive first, he's telling you to take spiritual headship over your husband because he's telling you to love your husband like Christ loves the church. Did you get that? Now, does that mean that women are exempt from loving like Jesus? Yeah, no. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that very often the same spiritual leaders who would go blue in the face insisting that the husband should be the default decision maker, boss, teller of every aspect of the home will tell the wife to go home and love her husband like Christ loves the church instead of holding the husband accountable to love his wife as Christ loves the church. And that is inside out. All power given by God is for the purpose of protecting others and never to exploit or oppress. Any power which is used to exploit, to remove autonomy, to revoke your voice, to oppress, or to enable others to cause harm, rather than to uplift, to empower, and to call to accountability, is originating in the character of Satan and is blaspheming the character of God. Somebody told me just before this started, she said, I invited friends. I told them you don't mince words. I was like, I hope I can live up to that promise. So, we'll start with that one. If we are using power to exploit, we are emulating the character of Satan as spiritual leaders in the faith community. This was created by Jennifer and Nicole, my two colleagues, and this is a wheel that talks about, I think it was, wasn't it? Didn't you guys do this one? Or did Jennifer maybe? So using male privilege, using coercion and threats, using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, minimizing, denying, blaming, using children, these are forms of power, taking power over a spouse and a family that are not like Jesus. Protection looks different. Protection looks like negotiation and fairness, non-threatening behavior, respect and honor, trust and support, honesty and accountability, responsible parenting, and sharing responsibility. Here's the thing, and this is super, super important. Before we move any further, we must define what abuse is and what abuse is not. Now, would you agree with me that losing your temper and yelling at someone is an abusive action? Yes? No? Yes. Okay. How many of us have ever lost our temper and said something we regret? Yeah, every single hand. Does that mean you are categorically an abuser? Some of you are shaking your head. Some of you are wondering, what should I answer to that? Is this a trick question? It's not a trick question. Abuse is not a single action. Now, a single action can categorize abuse. You assault someone. That is abuse. Okay? There are some things that cross the line where a single, isolated, forceful rape, yep, that's abuse, even if it's not a pattern. That one, it stands alone. Punching someone in the head, yep, that's abuse. You don't need to do it 5 or 6 times in a solid pattern for it to qualify. But there are many things that any of us can do as humans that in a pattern, unrepentant, are abusive behaviors. But that does not make every single person who's ever done those things into an abuser. Abuse is a system, a pervasive, repeating pattern of behavior of taking power over others and controlling them. Oh, look, I had that actually written down on the next slide. That's awesome. So, what about narcissism? Narcissism, you're in that narc. We hear a lot of buzz phrases. If you hang out in any recovery, healing, advocacy group, you hear this all the time. And after a little while, everyone is a narc, which means no one is a narc, because everyone who ever looked at you cross-eyed or didn't give you what you want or took too long in the checkout line, it must be because they're a narcissist, and oh my goodness, I have categorized them and labeled them and checked off all the boxes, and now I don't actually have to be nice to them, I don't have to show Jesus to them because they're a narc. Well, so let's back off from that a little bit. People's ideas of narcissism can range from teenagers who take too many selfies with weird duck lips to malignant toxicity. And not all those things can actually be a healthy working definition of the term, right? I mean, you can't put someone who will, with evil, destroy another person in the same category as a 16-year-old who's obsessed with their Instagram filters. Those don't belong in the same bucket. So, what do we deal with this? Well, narcissism is ultimately pathological selfishness, right? Nicole and I have had so many conversations about this. The spectrum of self-centeredness versus other-centeredness, we all fall on it. The innate belief or mindset that someone is entitled to control another person, that you're superior to those around them. But see, we all struggle with that on some degree, right? We all look at other people somewhere, at some point in your life, and think, well, at least I'm not like whatever it is. I used to, and I would not say this is narcissistic, but hey, it's along those lines. I used to say I was never going to be one of those moms who went to Walmart in my pajamas. Just, oh my word, how does anyone stoop so low? How do you sink that low? Until the day, that one day, when I really, really needed something, and I had no one to go get it for me, and I had a baby and a toddler, and guess how I showed up at Walmart to get what I needed to get? And I remember walking in and thinking, I have become one of those women. But prior to that, I was kind of prideful, right? I'm like, well, at least I'm not like, the women who go to Walmart in their pajamas. And that's not like a super sinful kind of thing. It's not like, being evil and determined to toxically tear someone down. But it's a pride thing. And it's a sense of superiority. I'm better than that because I actually put my hair in a ponytail or put on some eyeliner. Like that one little thing makes me so different. Like it's still dry shampoo for the last 16 days. No, I'm kidding. So when we're talking about actual narcissism, we're talking about selfishness that is on such a scale to the point that you lose empathy and fixate completely on your own gain. Now, empathy can be faked for gain, but real empathy isn't about what you get from other people. The book, Why Does He Do That? By Lundy Bancroft, Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. The mindset of abusive males is not that I just need to manage my anger better. Abusers manage your anger just fine whenever someone you believe would be important is watching. If abusers did not manage their anger just fine, the rest of the world wouldn't think they were Mr. Perfect. So when there's that dissonance, it's because anger management is not the issue. The original narcissist in the selfishness spectrum was Lucifer, who became Satan. Isaiah 14:14 talks about his jealousy of God, his assumptions of his own power and authority, and seeking to be equal to God. I will climb to the highest heavens and be like the Most High. Ezekiel 28:2, in your great pride you claim, I am a god, I sit on a divine throne in the heart of the sea. The result of indulging pride without consequences and developing a mindset of entitlement is huge. And the next step, after Lucifer was thrown out of heaven and took a third of the angels with him, was to taunt humanity with the same desire. God knows that your eyes will be opened. As soon as you eat it, you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. Don't you want that? Don't you want to be entitled to everything? So there's this progression. Side note, do you ever find it hard to believe how good, honest people can fall for someone's abusive lies and not see the breakdown between inside and outside, the inside face and the outside face? Anybody else ever struggle with that? When you struggle with that and you're ready to throw in the towel, remember, that the angels lived in the very presence of a perfect God, and Lucifer still deceived a third of them. So is it really that shocking that an intelligent, glib, willing to lie human is capable of deceiving other humans? If Lucifer could deceive angels, and they had access to God, they knew God's character firsthand, and they were still deceived. They still made the choice to believe the lies. So it's really not that shocking that really good liars can convince people to believe them in today's world. So let's talk about this whole narcissism spectrum thing. Oh, whoops, there we go. Lucifer, Jesus, opposite ends of the spectrum. On one hand, we have acute extreme selfishness. I'm looking at it backwards up there and backwards here, and I gotta reverse it. Acute extreme selfishness. And on the other hand, we have completely seeking to serve the best interests of others. And all of us, we're that little blue dot. We move somewhere along that spectrum, right? Lucifer is all take. Christ is all give. The more we move along that spectrum in selfishness or other-centeredness, the more we become like Jesus or like Lucifer. The ultimate character of Lucifer becomes Satan, is power and control. So this means that, and I'm behind, here we go, I'll give, I'll take, there we go. This means that in real life, in our daily interaction in spiritual warfare, in being caught in the crosshairs of this battle between good and evil, Lucifer, Satan, Christ, Jesus, they each have a toolbox. These are the things, the tactics, the modalities that Satan and Jesus are allowed to use. Satan's got a whole lot. Every tool and trick imaginable. Power, control, doubt, bullying, fear, enticement, intimidation, flattery, oppression, spin, deceive, dictate, coerce, manipulate, dominate, seduce, sway, destroy, smear, force, second guess, persuade. All of it. He can use whatever works on your personality, whatever works on your mind, whatever works with your wounds. Whatever you are most susceptible to based on all your aces, that's what he'll use. A custom-defined strategy for you. Jesus, his toolbox looks a little different. 2 Thessalonians 2:10, I want to share this before we move on to Jesus here. And that is, he will use, this is speaking of Satan, every kind of evil deception to fool those on their way to destruction. Which kinds of evil deception? Every kind of evil deception, because they refuse to love and accept the truth that would save them. Jesus Christ uses one thing, love. And love tells the truth and lets us choose. This means that according to God's character, we each have to reap the consequences of our choices. That means that when we try to save those who cause harm from others from experiencing the natural consequences of their choices, we try to use the gospel to prevent them from feeling the full consequences of the path they've chosen, we are not loving them. We'll talk more about that in a little while. Again, God will draw us to himself with love or not at all. Satan disguised himself as an angel of light to tempt Jesus in the wilderness. Extremely selfish people, those the world would call narcissistic people, often disguise themselves as good, compassionate individuals. So on a side note, here's just a side note, caveat, store this away. on the side of spiritual abuse when any of our evangelism or outreach strategies use any single one of those tools from the side on Satan's toolbox. Bullying, persuading, dictating, coercing, fear, any of that stuff to promote or persuade others of the truth, we are blaspheming the character of God. And we are breaking the third commandment by taking God's name in vain and aligning ourselves with Satan's heart while cloaking it in the facade of truth. Because true love brings freedom. Love speaks truth. 1 John 3, 18 and 19. Dear children, let us not merely say that we love each other. Let's show the truth by our actions. Our actions show that we belong to the truth, so we can be confident when we stand before God. So God says, how does God approach things where we have opportunities to choose? God says, this is the truth. This is what will happen if you choose X, Y, Z versus A, B, C, and the choice is yours. That's it. Informed choices. Love does not coexist with fear. For God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but of power and love and what? Self-discipline, self-control. That's 2 Timothy 1:7. If a relationship at home, at work, at church is leaving you in fear, if you are living in fear, if you feel like a prisoner in your home, a prisoner at work, a prisoner in that relationship, it is not love. If someone comes to you and you're a church leader and they're saying that they are living in fear, you can know that their marriage, this relationship, is not based in love. And if we, church leaders, are afraid to rock the boat by addressing an issue with a person who is causing trouble because we're scared of what they're capable of, we have just proved to ourselves that they are an abusive person because we don't want to confront them because we're scared of them. If you would rather back away from dealing with an issue, especially in churches, because you're worried about what that person might do, imagine what it would be like to be married and living with them. Love brings freedom. John 17:17, make them holy by your truth. My word is truth. You are truly my disciples, John 8:31. If you remain faithful to my teachings, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Love brings freedom. You cannot fix someone who doesn't choose to change. And not even God can do that. Do you know why? Not because he isn't capable, but because the one thing that ties God's hands is when we say, no, God, you can't. Because God does not violate free will, not even to change sinners. And if he did, wouldn't he have just slapped the fruit out of Eve's hands? If God was okay with violating consent, violating free will, he would have just said, excuse me, Eve, we've talked about this, and taken it away. And if he didn't with Eve because she was genuinely being deceived, surely he would have with Adam, who was making an eyes wide open conscious choice, right? But he didn't. Nor did he destroy Lucifer after his rebellion in heaven. Because love without free will isn't love at all. Let's say it again. Love without free will is not love at all. Love respects choice. Even the choice of someone else to stay toxic. Even the choice of someone else to refuse to change. God respects it. This is where, we'll talk about this more a little later too, but this is where the opposite of codependency is brought in by the gospel. One of the issues with codependency is being so attached to a person that you try to fix everything, you try to change everything, you try to get them to do the right thing. No, you are violating their free will. If You want to love like Jesus loves. We do not force people to change, even if they are destroying themselves and others. We remove ourselves from the situation. We remove the others who are being destroyed from the situation, and we allow that person to come face to face with Jesus and choose to change or not on their own terms. God realizes that treating toxic people with kindness does not make them stop hurting other people. She says, say it louder for the people in the back, although I think you're already awake and listening. God knows that treating toxic people with kindness does not make them stop hurting people. Here's why. They don't have a conscience that's acting like yours does. By the time that you can harm others with impunity, your conscience is already dying to dead. Which means that being confronted by your pastor, having a friend say, hey, you really should stop doing that to your wife or your kids, it isn't going to work on your conscience because your conscience is already seared past that point because you're capable of doing it in the first place. Instead, God removes himself when he is persistently rejected and abused. That is why God divorced Israel. Isaiah 26:10, your kindness to the wicked does not make them do good. Although others do right, the wicked, those who choose to persistently stay in toxic patterns, the wicked keep doing wrong and take no notice of the Lord's majesty. Nicole Parker's best-selling book, Sanctuary Light, says some sins are especially damaging to relationships. God can forgive any sin if the person repents. But people who murder and rape have spent much time persistently rejecting God's voice. They must be removed from relationships with other people because those sinful choices harm others so much. There are two types of crimes in the Old Testament under Moses' law that were death penalty crimes, and those were murder and rape, sexual assault. Deuteronomy 22:25 is a verse that shows that the only crime in Scripture where the general rule of 2 to 3 reliable witnesses among the elders did not apply was sexual assault. Now, how many times do you know of rape or sexual assault happening in front of credible, reliable, multiple witnesses? Because that's always how sexual assault and molestation happens, right? In front of all the people who could tell on you. God knew that too. He knew that that's not how it works. And Deuteronomy 22:25 talks about how if a young woman had been sexually molested outside of town, the assumption was that she would have screamed and fought, and the assaulter, the rapist, was put to death on the merit of her testimony alone. Now, scholars assume that there might have been other witnesses, other evidence that would be measured in, torn clothes, these kinds of things. So we're not talking about everyone just having like a clean slate to go lie about somebody you don't like and get him stoned to death. We're not talking about that. We're talking about how seriously God considered this type of harm to other people. Toxic people, well, anyone, but especially because we're talking about toxic people must choose to change because they want to be different badly enough to do the work that it takes to become healthy. I don't even know who said it, but we don't change until the pain of staying the same is greater. The pain of changing is less than the great pain of staying the same. I am mangling that. You know the one I'm talking about, right? That's when we decide to change. When it hurts more to stay the way we are than it does to actually take some action on doing something different. So if it never hurts, if there's never any consequences, if there's never any loss related to what we do to harm other people, then why would we change? Especially if our conscience is dying or dead or completely numbed and seared. Why would we change? Love allows consequences. You are free to choose. You are not free from the consequences of your choice. Churches cannot shelter toxic people from consequences. I cannot tell you how often I hear stories about well-intended church leaders, sometimes even pastors. I know of one situation where a teacher had been molesting multiple students at a private church school. And it came out. And the pastor helped the teacher escape law enforcement and get across state lines into hiding to avoid actually being held accountable. And then they kept finding more children, and there was a history there. And that pastor's job was to help that man find accountability, not escape it. When spiritual leaders send abused spouses back into that environment without offering help, when spiritual leaders use their power to enable those causing harm to escape or minimize their consequences, we are taking the side of Lucifer. Here's a hard one. God will not answer your prayers to save your marriage if doing that means violating your spouse's freedom of choice to stay toxic. I get messages and emails so often from women saying, "Why doesn't God answer my prayers? Why has my husband not changed? Why has my toxic parent not changed? Why has my dangerous sibling not changed? Why am I still in this situation?" And the answer is because that other person has not chosen to change, and their choice is what is limiting God's miracle. Not one of us is beyond the capacity of redemption and transformation by the gospel of Jesus Christ, unless we say no thank you. And then we are, because we have placed ourselves on the other side of his redemptive arm, out of reach. Praying for an abusive situation is absolutely important, but it's also important to know when to walk away. And love, Jesus' love, knows when to walk away. We talked about codependency already, trying over and over and over again to fix people who refuse to change for themselves. That's not love. It's a form, actually, of control and coercion, which makes you trying to abuse them as they are trying to abuse you, and you're trying to abuse them to get them out of abusing you, and that is an unhealthy cycle that can only be broken when you step back and step away. Because true love knows that the pain of consequences is what brings transformation and humility. And as long as we are trying to minimize someone's consequences to get them to choose to change, and they're not choosing it for themselves, we are exacerbating the situation. This happens in churches too. Yep, there we go. When it comes to churches and homes and workplaces, one person who refuses to change, left unchecked and unconfronted, can cause tremendous harm. John Climacus, quoted in the brand new book by Gary Thomas called When to Walk Away, says that a single wolf helped by a demon can trouble an entire flock. I'm going to say that again. A single wolf helped by a demon can trouble an entire flock. Love does not seek false holiness. Here's another one. Now, a lot of times we talk about how Jesus suffered, right? Didn't Jesus suffer? And he suffered for us, and that's true. Now, one of the horrible twists that I hear on that is when pastors have told women to go back home and you should be proud to suffer. Anybody ever heard that? Yes, I see nodding heads. You should be proud to suffer for Christ at the hands of your husband. Didn't Jesus suffer too? One woman, this is a quote from her pastor. She went to her pastor and told him that she was afraid her husband would kill her and their children. And his response was, "He's only threatening you with heaven. Why are you afraid?" Direct quote. So that's not what true love is. Proverbs 22:3 says, "The prudent see danger and actually do what? Take refuge. The simple keep on going and pay the penalty." So that tells us that if we are stuck in a toxic, dangerous, abusive situation and we keep going and pay the penalty, it's not because of our holy suffering for Jesus Christ. It's because we're being simple-minded. We're staying when we should be leaving and seeking safety. Staying in abuse does not make us extra holy. Gary Thomas, in the book When to Walk Away, says, "Love knows that the pain of consequences brings transformation and humility. Kindness to toxic people does not do them good, and our goal is to bring others to salvation. That requires them to see that they are causing harm and to experience the consequences." Now, this can be challenging because very often the perpetrator is more popular and more powerful, and in speaking truth, you risk destroying people's idols because people would much rather believe that that person is awesome than to be confronted with crossing the threshold of disbelief. Ephesians 4:15 says, "Speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, and that is Christ." We are no longer idolizing humans. We are looking to worship Jesus. 1 Timothy 4:14 and 15, here's the thing. When you start talking about what actually happens in abusive situations, some people will say you're gossiping. Now, it's very important not to gossip. I'm not encouraging gossip. But character referencing is not gossip. And if someone is danger, staying silent is becoming complicit in their dangerousness. Right? Paul said, "Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works." You know, I think Paul was the kind of guy I would really like to hang out with. He had some strong words sometimes. "You must also be aware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words." He knew that it was wise to warn the innocent and the vulnerable of someone who could harm them. God's character equals love. And all of this leads us to the question of how do we spot those signs so that we can act in God's love? We're going to talk about that in detail tomorrow. And I want to end this presentation with a poem that was one of my favorites. When I was about 11 or 12, I had to memorize this. Josiah Gilbert Holland. "God, give us men. A time like this demands strong minds, great hearts, true faith, and ready hands. Men whom the lust of office does not kill. Men whom the spoils of office cannot buy. Men who possess opinions and a will. Men who have honor. Men who will not lie. Men who can stand before a demagogue and damn his treacherous flatteries without winking. Tall men, sun-crowned, who live above the fog in public duty and in private thinking. For while the rabble with their thumb-worn creeds, their large professions and their little deeds mingle in selfish strife, lo, freedom weeps, wrong rules the land, and waiting justice sleeps."